Hello and welcome to the WBEE. We are talking about world building today. It's not just for Dungeons and Dragons 5e or 2024, but it'll tilt that way. If you're looking for world building exercises, world building tips, or anything about world building cultures, you are in the right place. Yeah, that's a lot of world building, but the YouTube algorithm is listening, and this is an experiment. I hope you brought your bug spray and some waders because we're going to head into the swamps. You've probably heard me describe swamps as border biomes or a place for the monsters to hide. These things are totally true, but there's so much more to talk about. I'm Lewis Nichols, and I've been nerdy for about a million years. I've published a crappy RPG and a handful of fiction on Amazon. I've done conventions from Galveston to Sudbury and produced over 300 videos on this channel. I've got a small but growing body of work on Incarnate and D&D Beyond. I have a plan, and you're a part of it, so hit that like button, subscribe, and never forget to leave a comment. I am glad each and every one of you are here. Now let's get sweaty. For the purposes of our video, a swamp is any patch of uncultivated land where water collects. It's got to be shallow enough to harbor vegetation and deep enough to make a home for the fishes. Overall, the land is somewhat uneven, varying plus or minus 10 feet. Anomalies are certainly possible. You may have some deep pools and a few places where the land is always dry, or at least a little less than damp. Also, it's got to be big enough to support a few medium or large creatures. This is not a backyard koi pond. We need room to roam. There are a lot of synonyms for swamp. They used to be regional terms. Nowadays, sciencey types have defined them down to be more specific. I use the middle ground, tending toward a modern feel of the word, but giving myself the freedom to use labels and titles that provide a good sense of locality. In other words, if the Galta Fen is more of a bog, I'm not going to lose any sleep over it. The biggest divergence of these definitions is probably the marsh. Comparing the two, marshes are more water and less trees. They are heavy on high grasses and more likely to facilitate large boats. It's probably not a complete list, but the following might be helpful labels: swamps, wetland, marsh, bogs, river delta, fen, moor, and mire. All of these can have saltwater versions. I suppose the first thing to remember when you're mapping a swamp is that you need water. It can be where a river spreads out and gets shallow. In rainy areas, it can just be the low-lying area between hills. And it doesn't have to be warm. There are definitely cold water swamps, moors, fens, whatever you're calling them on your particular map on a particular day. I live in northern Ontario, and there are swamps and marshes everywhere. It's extremely varied terrain, with a mix of plains, low mountains, coasts around large and abundant lakes, and swamps of several varieties. A lot of these patches are just a few acres or a few hundred acres, but nothing truly expansive. Critters overlap too, with deer, raccoon, skunk, and even moose regularly coming into low density urban areas. Brown bear are definitely something to keep an eye out for. I think it's an important lesson when you map out a giant swath of, let's say, forest on your map. It's probably going to be broken up on a regular basis by island biomes. Not real islands, but like 1,000 acres of marsh here or a bunch of hills over there. And they might not even show up on your map due to scale, but just remember they're mixed in there in most cases. This is why topography is important, and then laying down sensible rivers. It might just be seasonal, but you're going to have a few areas out there where the rivers spread out and things get shallow, leaving plenty of room for marsh, or if you're in a forest, a real live swamp. When this happens, instead of boating and fishing, you have, well, boating and fishing, but also hunting and monster hunting. And that's a lesson inside a lesson. Swamps are highly diverse in both plant life and animal. You don't have to have just land dwellers and fish. You have all those specialized little critters that are both. That means reptiles, bugs, amphibians, bugs, mammals, things that like to swim, bugs, bats that eat bugs, birds that eat small mammals, and don't forget the bugs. So what are the challenges of traveling in a swamp? I don't mean to harp on bugs, but if you have never been nonstop harassed by biting insects for hours or days, you just don't know what it does to you. I do wish 5e had a better sanity mechanic. Still might homebrew that for myself. There are things you can do short of rewriting core rules. You are fully in your rights to have just this environmental factor inflict exhaustion, cause perception penalties, or temporarily diminish a player's con or wisdom. Fresh water is another issue. I think I'd rather drink a glass of salty ocean water than chance a brew from a swamp. At least the ocean water is usually cold. Boiling and straining is the real world solution. It's fantasy though, so you have magical options both in spells and in items. I am sure that your DM will still let the former work if magic fails you, but that means a fire that can be spotted. On another survival note, I think one of the biggest pre-game jobs for a DM is determining how to handle things like survival spells, exhaustion, and rests. True, there are book rules, however using them can easily negate most environmental hardships. I outlawed Goodberry, but that's about it. And I've thought a lot about it over the last year, and I think I'm probably going to be harder on the next party next time around. It's easy to nerf the creation of food and water, and I would definitely be harder on letting the characters full rest in harsh conditions. Next up, we have the Deadly Sisters of Pestilence and Disease. This is another matter to think about in campaign prep. Disease gets about a page in the DMG, most of which is describing 3 possible illnesses for your campaign world. Hey, that would be another nice series of shorts. 21 diseases to make your PCs suffer. I like it. Now, I decided a long time ago that my diseases were not microbial or viral. They're just bad energy. But honestly, that's just flavor. It doesn't make a lot of difference because it's functionally the same in most cases. The point is, swamps are bad juju, and the odds of somebody or everybody catching something nasty is very high. Play it up. Let your disease-immune characters benefit from their early decisions. And torture everybody else. Now what about those sight lines? Foggy, forested swamps are probably my favorite for obvious reasons. Prep time is always a factor that favors the party, so you can get the most out of your monsters when you can just call initiative and get right into melee. Even if the area isn't heavily forested, a walking party is going to be waiting a lot, which is going to cut down their maximum sighting distance. And there's the excitement of whatever might be swimming around there with them. When preparing your biome, it's always important to note the most likely spotting ranges, so you'll be prepared for your next not-so-random encounter. Travel time is an issue too. Even in a relatively peaceful swamp, it's going to slow you down. There are certainly going to be swamps that you can boat through or even walk without too much trouble. I would still consider it at least a 20% penalty, but with a good guide, that might get negated. In a denser swamp, you might be slow to making just 5 miles a day. This depends heavily on the party's composition, the weather, and the nature of the swamp itself. And finally, we have my favorite entry on any list, weird stuff. There's a lot of crazy swamp monsters, of course, but there's also the potential for semi-natural circumstances that slow or threaten the party. There's methane plumes. Swamp gas is definitely a thing, and it's fantasy, so amp that stuff up. These can impede breathing, or they can explode into huge jets of flame. And what about ghost lights? Bad sight lines, strange gases, and simple fog can easily create images detectable only at the outskirts of peripheral vision. Take advantage of a little swish to mess with your high PP PCs. Maybe they're on alert so much from all the distractions, they finally don't ruin your bullywug ambush. Oh, watch your step. There's one more thing we haven't talked about. Have you ever been wading in a pond or a river and hit a hole? One second the water is a foot deep, and the next you're sinking fast. Anytime you have a lot of water action, there is a chance to hollow out sinkholes, and vegetation can camouflage that stuff. You should probably give your PC a deck save to present something major, but it's slippery, and you are covered in distracting mosquito bites. DC 19 sounds about right. At disadvantage. Now, if you're feeling generous, the character who's now bleeding out in the snake pit might have just discovered the remains of an ancient ruin full of gold. Alright, checking on the word count, we have time for a little bit of discussion about food chains. In a swamp, life is both rich and complex. The base of the food chain is clearly the bugs, plants, and small fish. Next in line, you have slightly bigger fish, the herbaceous mammals, amphibians, and reptiles. Up the chain, you have predatory birds, big snakes, wildcats, and similar critters. Then stronger hunters such as crocs, eagles, and humanoids. Don't forget the pack hunters. Finally, we get right into the fantasy flora and fauna, the super predators that fill our monster manuals. I would spend some time in preparation. It should be fairly easy for you to name 5 animals and some plants for each tier of the list. It'll give you talking points. Add character to your swamp. Those minor details are things that you can throw out as part of descriptions or base larger decisions on. You might want to rule out humanoids completely, lean into dinosaurs, or go entirely insect-based with larger forms in abundance. There are dead swamps, with almost no animal life but haunted by the undead. Or fire swamps, where fire takes the place of moisture and rock-based plant analogies have taken over. Yeah, it's probably more of a fire zone though, not a swamp really. Alright, as usual, the only way to stop the rambling is to end the video. Tell me what I missed in the comments. Let's talk about your favorite swamp, in-game or real life. Either one's fine. Hit that like button if you can. I'd like to see you all next week. Not sure what kind of video yet. We're definitely going to do some swamp exercises. We need to do some rules-based stuff too, so I'll probably throw out a poll. Remember, it only takes 1 or 2, maybe 3 votes to get the subject that you want to talk about on the board. Either way, I'm sure it's going to be amazing. Just like you. I want to thank you all for stopping by. Cheers.